So this HOA Karen thought she could bulldoze my 40-acre apple orchard at 5 a.m. while I was sleeping, forge my signature on demolition permits, and build her luxury resort on my family's land. Too bad for her. I'm the county permits director who's been approving every single shovel of dirt in this town for 15 years. I'm standing here in what used to be 30 years of my father's blood, sweat, and Honeycrisp trees, breathing diesel fumes mixed with the sickly sweet smell of crushed apple blossoms ground into the mud under my work boots. That bulldozer behind me? Still warm from destroying everything my family built. She bribed inspectors, framed me for tax evasion, threatened to foreclose on my 78-year-old neighbors, and even brought in mob money from Phoenix, thinking she'd won. But when someone messes with a dying man's legacy and tries to destroy an entire community for profit, they just declared war on the wrong permits director and I had FBI backup. What would you do if someone stole your family's life work while you slept? Tell me where you're watching from. Your HOA probably has monsters too. Let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started. My name's Jake Morrison, and 3 generations of my family have been growing apples on this land. My grandfather bought these 40 acres back in 1994 when it was just scrubland and a dream. My father spent 30 years turning it into something special premium Honeycrisp and Gala varieties that supplied half the farmers' markets in the county. When Dad had his heart attack in 2018, I had a choice to make. I could keep struggling to make the farm profitable, or I could take the steady paycheck as county permits director. The irony wasn't lost on me, becoming the guy who approves construction permits while trying to save agricultural land. But Dad's medical bills were crushing us, and somebody had to keep the lights on. That's how I ended up in the most important job I never knew I'd need. Enter Delia Prescott, 52 years old, fresh from Phoenix with a designer handbag full of lawsuits and a voice that could shatter windows 3 counties over. She moved into Willowbrook Estates, the luxury development right next to my farm in January with one mission: turn our quiet rural community into her personal ATM. You know those people who complain about the smell of fresh bread near a bakery? Well, Delia complained about the smell of apple blossoms. In spring, on a farm. That had been there for 30 years before she showed up. Within her first month, Delia filed 47 HOA violations against various neighbors. The sound of her designer heels clicking across courthouse marble became the soundtrack of our nightmares. She'd show up to every meeting with this leather portfolio thick as a phone book, taking photos with an expensive camera like she was documenting war crimes instead of my 30-year-old tractor. But here's where it got personal. She hit my farm with a $15,000 remediation fee, claiming my irrigation system violated some obscure county health code. When I asked to see the specific violation, she produced a document with my signature on it, except I'd never seen that paper in my life. She'd forged my name on a compliance agreement I never signed. That night, sitting in my kitchen with the taste of metallic fear coating my tongue, I spread out legal documents next to Dad's old farming journals. The coffee went cold as I read through page after page of bureaucratic nightmare, trying to understand how someone could just steal your signature and make it legal. Luckily, I had allies. Carmen, my deputy clerk at the permits office, had worked county government for 20 years and could smell bureaucratic bullshit from 3 zip codes away. And Big Mike, the local contractor who'd helped Dad build our barn, had already started getting pressure from Delia to overcharge neighbors for required improvements. See, Delia had a pattern. My lawyer cousin Tony did some digging through court records and found she'd pulled the same scheme in Phoenix, Tucson, and Flagstaff. Target small landowners, overwhelm them with legal fees, then swoop in with lowball buyout offers when they couldn't afford to fight anymore. The first sign something bigger was happening came in March. Strange men in expensive suits started showing up, surveying property lines with equipment that hummed like angry wasps. When I asked what they were doing, they mumbled something about preliminary assessments and drove off in rental cars with Phoenix plates, leaving behind the acrid smell of hot asphalt and something that felt like menace. Then the anonymous buyer started calling with that telemarketer urgency. This offer expires in 48 hours. Development pressure is coming whether you like it or not. Better to sell now while you still can. But the real gut punch came when I found out what happened to the Kowalskis. This elderly couple had been raising chickens next door for 47 years, until Delia's HOA hit them with violation fines that forced them into bankruptcy proceedings. 47 years of building a life, wiped out by someone who'd lived here for 3 months. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my farm. This was about the entire soul of our community. Delia wasn't just some difficult neighbor. She was running a systematic campaign to steal everything our families had built. The question was, what was I prepared to do about it? Let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started. My name's Jake Morrison, and 3 generations of my family have been growing apples on this land. My grandfather bought these 40 acres back in 1994 when it was just scrubland and a dream. My father spent 30 years turning it into something special premium Honeycrisp and Gala varieties that supplied half the farmers markets in the county. When Dad had his heart attack in 2018, I had a choice to make. I could keep struggling to make the farm profitable, or I could take the steady paycheck as county permits director. The irony wasn't lost on me, becoming the guy who approves construction permits while trying to save agricultural land. But Dad's medical bills were crushing us, and somebody had to keep the lights on. That's how I ended up in the most important job I never knew I'd need. Enter Delia Prescott, 52 years old, fresh from Phoenix with a designer handbag full of lawsuits and a voice that could shatter windows 3 counties over. She moved into Willowbrook Estates, the luxury development right next to my farm, in January with one mission: turn our quiet rural community into her personal ATM. You know those people who complain about the smell of fresh bread near a bakery? Well, Delia complained about the smell of apple blossoms in spring on a farm. That had been there for 30 years before she showed up. Within her first month, Delia filed 47 HOA violations against various neighbors. The sound of her designer heels clicking across courthouse marble became the soundtrack of our nightmares. She'd show up to every meeting with this leather portfolio thick as a phone book, taking photos with an expensive camera like she was documenting war crimes instead of my 30-year-old tractor. But here's where it got personal. She hit my farm with a $15,000 remediation fee, claiming my irrigation system violated some obscure county health code. When I asked to see the specific violation, she produced a document with my signature on it, except I'd never seen that paper in my life. She'd forged my name on a compliance agreement I never signed. That night, sitting in my kitchen with the taste of metallic fear coating my tongue, I spread out legal documents next to Dad's old farming journals. The coffee went cold as I read through page after page of bureaucratic nightmare, trying to understand how someone could just steal your signature and make it legal. Luckily, I had allies. Carmen, my deputy clerk at the permits office, had worked county government for 20 years and could smell bureaucratic bullshit from 3 zip codes away. And Big Mike, the local contractor who'd helped Dad build our barn, had already started getting pressure from Delia to overcharge neighbors for required improvements. See, Delia had a pattern. My lawyer cousin Tony did some digging through court records and found she'd pulled the same scheme in Phoenix, Tucson, and Flagstaff. Target small landowners, overwhelm them with legal fees, then swoop in with lowball buyout offers when they couldn't afford to fight anymore. The first sign something bigger was happening came in March. Strange men in expensive suits started showing up, surveying property lines with equipment that hummed like angry wasps. When I asked what they were doing, they mumbled something about preliminary assessments and drove off in rental cars with Phoenix plates, leaving behind the acrid smell of hot asphalt and something that felt like menace. Then the anonymous buyers started calling with that telemarketer urgency. This offer expires in 48 hours. Development pressure is coming whether you like it or not. Better to sell now while you still can. But the real gut punch came when I found out what happened to the Kowalskis. This elderly couple had been raising chickens next door for 47 years until Delia's HOA hit them with violation fines that forced them into bankruptcy proceedings. 47 years of building a life, wiped out by someone who'd lived here for 3 months. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my farm. This was about the entire soul of our community. Delia wasn't just some difficult neighbor. She was running a systematic campaign to steal everything our families had built. The question was, what was I prepared to do about it? The first real shot across the bow came on a Tuesday morning in April. I was in my kitchen, drinking coffee that actually tasted good for once, when I heard heavy footsteps on my front porch, the kind of footsteps that announce bad news before the person even opens their mouth. A process server stood there at 6 a.m. sharp holding a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. Jake Morrison, you've been served. Delia was suing me for violating residential zoning laws. According to her lawsuit, my farm was illegally operating on land that had been zoned residential only since 1987. She'd somehow produced an original county zoning map that showed my 40 acres as part of a planned housing development that never existed. The legal document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic terrorism. 43 pages of whereas this and therefore that, demanding immediate cessation of all agricultural activities plus damages for diminished property values in the amount of $250,000. Her Phoenix law firm, the kind that advertises on billboards with taglines like "We don't get paid unless you do," had filed for an emergency injunction. They wanted a judge to shut down my farm within 30 days, because apparently nothing says emergency like apple trees that have been growing peacefully for 30 years. But here's the thing about being the county permits director. You learn to read the fine print. And Delia's fine print had more holes than my irrigation system after a particularly ambitious gopher family moved in. I spent the next 3 days buried in the courthouse basement, breathing in that musty smell of old paper and forgotten dreams, pulling every zoning record from 1987 to present. Carmen helped me cross-reference section numbers while Big Mike brought us coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a dirty sock, but we needed the caffeine. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects as we spread documents across metal tables, creating a paper trail timeline that would make a detective proud. What we found was beautiful in its simplicity. My farm had been grandfathered agricultural in 1994 when the county updated zoning codes. The documentation was rock-solid original surveyor signatures, county commissioner approvals, even environmental impact assessments. Everything legal and binding. But more importantly, Delia's evidence was completely fabricated. Her zoning map used section numbers that didn't exist until 2003. The county seal was wrong, missing the small eagle that had been added in 1995. And the surveyor who supposedly signed it? He'd died in 1986, a full year before the map was allegedly created. Grandfathering laws protect pre-existing land use forever, even when surrounding zoning changes. Always verify historical records through official county archives, not copies provided by opposing parties. Tony, my lawyer cousin, nearly choked on his beer when I showed him the evidence. "Jake, she didn't just lie to the court. She forged government documents. That's a federal crime." But the mini twist came when Tony did some deeper digging into Delia's legal history. She'd filed identical lawsuits in Phoenix, same language, same fake zoning maps, same emergency injunction requests, 3 times, against elderly farmers who couldn't afford to fight back. Her pattern was surgical. Target property owners over 65, file complex lawsuits with expensive legal teams, then offer settlement buyouts at 30 cents on the dollar when the legal bills started mounting. In Phoenix, she'd acquired 4 farms this way, demolished them, and built strip malls. I remember standing in my apple orchard that evening, watching the sunset paint the trees gold, realizing I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for every small landowner who'd been bulldozed by someone with deeper pockets and fewer morals. The sound of my printer running for 2 straight hours became the soundtrack of my counterattack. I filed a 47-page response that included every forged document, every legal precedent, and every piece of evidence showing Delia's systematic fraud. But I didn't stop there. Using my access to the county permits database, I pulled every construction permit for Willowbrook Estates. Turns out Delia's own property had 17 code violations, unpermitted deck additions, illegal septic modifications, and structures built 3 feet into the county setback zone. The irony was delicious. She was demanding I follow zoning laws while flagrantly violating them herself. I filed a countersuit for frivolous litigation, harassment, and fraud. But the real weapon was simpler. I scheduled a routine code enforcement inspection of her property for the following Monday. Carmen handed me the inspection orders with a grin that could have powered the county building for a week. "Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, boss." That weekend, I sat on my porch listening to the spring breeze rustle through apple blossoms, knowing I'd just escalated this fight to a whole new level. Delia wanted to play legal hardball with forged documents and emergency injunctions? Game on. But I had a feeling she was just getting started. And honestly, so was I. Delia's response to my countersuit was swift and vicious. If I thought forged zoning maps were bad, I was about to learn what real corruption looked like when someone has a Rolodex full of bought officials and 0 moral boundaries. On a foggy Thursday morning in May, 3 men in official-looking uniforms showed up at my farm claiming to be state agricultural inspectors. They had clipboards, badges, and that bureaucratic arrogance that makes honest people feel guilty for breathing. The lead inspector, a thin man with a mustache that belonged in a 1970s adult film, informed me that my apple trees were diseased and posed a significant environmental threat. "We're going to need you to remove all infected vegetation within 14 days, he said, pointing at trees that had never looked healthier. State emergency powers, no appeals. The whole thing smelled fishier than the Kowalski's chicken coop during an August heat wave. I mean, these trees were so healthy they practically glowed, but apparently they were agricultural typhoid Mary, according to Inspector Pornstash. I asked to see their credentials. The badges looked official enough, but the lamination was bubbling at the edges like a fake ID made in someone's basement. When I called the state agriculture department, they'd never heard of any of these guys. Turns out their inspection van was a budget rental from Phoenix with magnetic door signs that probably cost $30 on Amazon. But Delia wasn't done playing dress-up government. The next week, our actual county health inspector, a nervous guy named Phillips who sweated through his shirt even in air conditioning, showed up with a condemnation notice for my irrigation system. The acrid smell of his cheap cologne mixed with fear sweat as he claimed my system violated groundwater contamination protocols I'd never heard of. Here's where having security cameras hidden in birdhouses pays off better than a winning lottery ticket. I watched Phillips inspect my perfectly functional irrigation for about 10 minutes, then get into his county truck where Delia was waiting with a manila envelope. Through my telephoto lens, I could see her counting out what looked like crisp hundreds while Phillips signed documents on his dashboard. The crunch of gravel under her designer heels was audible even from 50 yards away as she walked back to her car. They'd just conducted county business like a drug deal behind a 7-Eleven. Always verify inspector credentials through official state databases before allowing property access. Real inspectors carry official photo ID with direct agency contact information, not just badges that could be ordered online. While I was collecting evidence of Delia's amateur theater troupe, Carmen was doing real detective work at the courthouse. She discovered that 3 of our 5 county commissioners had taken educational conferences to Las Vegas airfare, hotels, and entertainment, all paid by Desert Development Consulting, which shared an address with Delia's Phoenix law firm. Those 3 commissioners had voted identically on every development issue for the past 6 months, like synchronized swimmers of corruption. The mini twist came when Big Mike brought me something that made my blood run cold. Delia hadn't just approached him about overcharging neighbors. She'd shown him architectural plans for a 200-room resort spanning my farm and 3 adjacent properties. "Jake," Mike said, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he spread the blueprints on my kitchen table. "She's not trying to buy your land. She's planning to take it through eminent domain. The resort is already designed. The plans were dated 6 months before she'd even moved to town. This wasn't opportunistic harassment. It was a premeditated land grab with federal implications." That night, listening to the recordings of Phillips taking his bribe, the digital player's red light pulsing like a heartbeat in my dark kitchen, I realized I wasn't just fighting a corrupt HOA president. I was fighting organized crime with a development permit. But the personal stakes escalated when Delia filed an ethics complaint claiming I was abusing my permits position to protect my own property. My phone started buzzing at 5 a.m. with calls from panicked commissioners asking if I was really corrupt. 7 years of honest service, destroyed by someone who'd been in town for 4 months. The local newspaper, apparently another victim of Delia's checkbook diplomacy, ran an editorial questioning whether county employees should own businesses in their jurisdiction. The metallic taste of professional assassination was sharp on my tongue as I read my character being murdered in print. But while Delia was playing political theater, I was building something beautiful, a federal case. Agent Sarah Morrison from FBI Financial Crimes was very interested in my evidence. "Mr. Morrison, you're documenting organized racketeering. This isn't local corruption, this is RICO territory." That weekend, walking through morning mist that made my orchard look like something from a fairy tale, I realized Delia had made one crucial mistake. She'd escalated a property dispute into a federal crime. And I had it all on tape. Just when I thought Delia couldn't sink any lower, she decided to go nuclear. And by nuclear, I mean she tried to frame me for tax evasion while simultaneously destroying my financial life with the precision of a financial serial killer. It started with a phone call on a Monday morning that made my coffee taste like liquid anxiety. An IRS agent named Thompson informed me that they'd received an anonymous tip about unreported income from my permits position. Apparently, I'd been taking kickbacks from contractors in exchange for expedited approvals. "We'll need to freeze your business and personal accounts pending investigation," Thompson said in that dead, bureaucratic tone that crushes souls for a living. "Standard procedure." The anonymous tip came with supporting evidence, bank deposit records, fake invoices, even doctored photos of me supposedly accepting cash payments in county parking lots. The quality was professional enough to fool someone who didn't know I haven't accepted cash for anything since 1995, when I realized handling dirty money makes my hands smell like other people's problems. Within 24 hours, I couldn't access my farm's operating account, my personal savings, or even my checking account. Try explaining to your harvest crew that you can't pay them because the government thinks you're a criminal, based on evidence manufactured by someone whose idea of agricultural expertise comes from watching Food Network. The taste of financial terror is surprisingly specific, like copper pennies mixed with stomach acid and the bitter aftertaste of complete helplessness. Meanwhile, Delia's media campaign went into overdrive. The local newspaper suddenly became the Corruption Chronicle, running stories about endemic graft in county government with suspiciously detailed information about my alleged crimes. The weekly radio talk show started fielding calls from concerned citizens, who all seemed to have identical talking points and suspiciously similar phone numbers. You know you're dealing with a professional when their character assassination comes with coordinated messaging and focus-grouped sound bites. But here's where being a permits director for 7 years pays off in unexpected ways. I knew every contractor, every inspector, every official who'd worked with me. And Carmen had kept meticulous records with the obsessive attention to detail of someone who'd watched too many crime documentaries. When the IRS started interviewing contractors about alleged kickbacks, something beautiful happened. Every single one told the truth, that I'd been scrupulously honest, sometimes annoyingly so. Big Mike actually laughed when they asked if I'd ever taken bribes. Jake Morrison? That man makes Boy Scouts look morally flexible. He once made me redo a permit application because my signature was in blue ink instead of black. The mini twist came when I was reviewing Delia's latest permit application for what she called a pool house renovation. The sharp scent of her expensive perfume still lingered on the documents. She'd hand-delivered them personally, probably to gloat. The application referenced property boundaries that didn't match county records. Her lot appeared to be 2 acres larger than what she actually owned. I pulled up the original survey, then cross-referenced it with current GIS mapping, the computer screen's blue glow reflecting off my increasingly hollow cheeks. The discrepancy was staggering. She'd been claiming ownership of 2 acres of county wetland preserve-protected environmental land that couldn't be developed under federal law. She wasn't just lying about property boundaries. She was claiming to own land that belonged to the American people. Property surveys must match deed descriptions exactly. Any discrepancies void ownership claims and can trigger federal environmental violations. Always verify property boundaries through official county GIS systems, not owner-provided documents. While I was discovering Delia's land grab, the community was buckling under her accelerated harassment campaign. The Kowalskis received a foreclosure notice after 47 years in their home. Widow Martinez got cited for unauthorized vegetable cultivation in her own backyard. Apparently, tomatoes are now weapons of mass property devaluation. Every elderly neighbor was getting hit with HOA fines designed to force them out. The smell of fear was becoming as common in our neighborhood as the scent of apple blossoms. But the personal cost was mounting like interest on a payday loan. My daughter called from college, her voice tight with tears, upset about social media posts claiming her father was a corrupt government official. My elderly mother was afraid to answer her phone after receiving threatening calls about her criminal son. The breaking point came when I realized the scope of Delia's plan. She wasn't just targeting my farm, she was systematically destroying the entire rural character of our community. The wetland she was claiming, that was going to be the golf course for her resort. I sat in my father's old chair that night, the leather cracked and worn smooth by decades of honest work, holding soil sample results that confirmed endangered salamanders lived in our irrigation ponds, the same ponds that Delia's fake inspectors had tried to condemn. The irony was perfect. She was trying to destroy protected habitat to build her monument to greed. That's when I stopped playing defense and started playing offense. Time to show Delia what happens when you declare war on someone who controls the permits for your entire criminal enterprise. The smoking gun came in the most ironic way possible. Delia needed my approval for her resort permits, which meant every document had to cross my desk. And that's when I discovered she'd made the kind of mistake that only happens when criminals get too confident in their own cleverness. Hidden in the 73rd page of her environmental impact assessment was a clause that made my blood run cold, the paper feeling suddenly heavy in my hands like it was made of lead instead of fiber. Her original HOA purchase agreement contained a provision I'd never seen before. Development rights contingent upon cessation of agricultural use within designated impact zone. She hadn't bought an HOA presidency. She'd bought a demolition contract. Delia had specifically targeted Willowbrook Estates because my farm was the keystone property. Remove agriculture from the area, and suddenly zoning restrictions that protected rural character would disappear. It was like pulling one card from a house of cards, except the cards were people's lives and the house was our entire community. The financial web was even more sinister. Using Secretary of State business records, I traced the shell company ownership through a maze that would make a tax attorney weep with admiration. Willowbrook Resort LLC, owned by Phoenix Development Partners, owned by Desert Sun Holdings, owned by Southwestern Investment Group. All roads led back to Delia, but with a twist that made my stomach churn. She owed $3.2 million to investors who weren't exactly the type to send polite reminder letters about late payments. The resort wasn't her dream project. It was her only escape from bankruptcy, lawsuits, and potentially kneecap adjustment therapy. The technical revelation that changed everything came when I analyzed the environmental surveys for her resort. The plans showed disruption of protected wetland areas, but Delia's surveys conveniently omitted the federally protected habitat she'd been illegally claiming to own. The musty smell of old environmental law textbooks filled my office as I researched federal regulations. But what I found was beautiful in its simplicity. When environmental law clashes with local zoning, federal law wins every time. Always. Environmental regulations always trump local zoning. Federal law supersedes everything, and EPA violations carry $37,500 daily fines plus criminal charges. Rachel Chen's investigation had uncovered the bigger picture. Delia wasn't just some HOA Karen with delusions of grandeur. She was part of a systematic land-grabbing operation targeting rural communities near growing cities across 4 states. Phoenix, Tucson, Flagstaff, and now us. Same playbook, different victims. The personal stakes became crystal clear when I found real estate appraisals hidden in her permit applications. My father had specifically chosen this property because of the wetland. It provided natural irrigation for apple trees and created a microclimate that made our fruit unusually sweet. 30 years of soil development, tree grafting, and agricultural expertise would be erased for a golf course and spa. Everything my family had built, destroyed so wealthy Phoenix tourists could have weekend getaways while complaining about the rustic charm of actual farming. The community impact was staggering. Her resort would require 2.3 million gallons of water daily, enough to drain community wells that had sustained our neighborhood for generations. Traffic would overwhelm roads designed for farm equipment, not tour buses full of people who think milk comes from cartons and apples grow in grocery stores. As I sat in my permits office that evening, Dad's photo watching over my shoulder with that knowing smile he'd worn when teaching me to graft apple trees, I realized something that made me grin for the first time in weeks. Delia had handed me the weapon to destroy her entire operation. As permits director, I could demand environmental compliance before any construction began. My office had the power to order stop work for any federal violations. And thanks to her arrogance in filing fraudulent applications, I had documentation of every environmental crime she'd planned. She thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. Turns out I'd been playing chess all along. I just hadn't realized I was holding all the important pieces. Time to make my move. Once I realized I was holding a royal flush in a game where Delia thought she was the only one who knew the rules, it was time to assemble my team. And by team, I mean a collection of people who were as tired of her bullshit as I was, but with skills that made us dangerous. First up was Tony, my lawyer cousin, who'd been coordinating with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit like he was running a legal fantasy football league. Agent Sarah Morrison had been building a federal case against Delia's Phoenix operation for months, but they needed someone with local evidence and credibility to make it stick. Lucky for them, they had a permits director with a security camera fetish and a deputy clerk who collected documentation like some people collect baseball cards. Carmen became our intelligence coordinator, using her 20 years of courthouse experience to create what we lovingly called the paper trail of doom. Yet every forged document, every fraudulent permit application, every bribed signature went into expanding file folders that were starting to look like evidence for a federal RICO case, which, as it turned out, was exactly what they were. FOIA requests can expose any government official's communications and financial dealings. Always submit requests in writing with specific date ranges and document types. Broad requests get denied. Specific ones reveal corruption. Big Mike took on the role of undercover contractor, agreeing to wear a wire during his next meeting with Delia about overcharging neighbors. The man had nerves of steel and the acting ability of someone who'd been dealing with difficult customers for 30 years. Plus, he genuinely enjoyed the idea of nailing someone who'd been trying to destroy his community. Rachel Chen, our investigative journalist, was preparing the expose that would run the day before the town council meeting where Delia planned to ram through her resort permits. She'd uncovered Delia's pattern across 3 other states and was coordinating with news outlets that had been following similar corruption stories. The media strategy was beautiful in its simplicity. Rachel's story would drop at noon on October 14th, just as the FBI was executing arrest warrants. Local TV agreed to cover the town council meeting live, and social media campaigns using #WillowbrookFraud were already gaining traction among people who dealt with similar HOA nightmares. But the technical preparation was where my permits director experience really paid off. I spent nights that smelled like stale coffee and determination, working overtime to document every permit irregularity in the county database. The sound of my printer running until 2 a.m. became a familiar lullaby as I created visual timelines with photos, documents, and recordings that would make a prosecutor weep tears of joy. I created overlay maps showing actual property boundaries versus Delia's fraudulent claims, with the protected wetland highlighted in bright red like a stop sign that she'd been ignoring for months. Every environmental violation was documented with GPS coordinates and photographic evidence that would hold up in federal court. The financial investigation results were even more damning than we'd hoped. Delia's Phoenix investors turned out to be shell companies for mob-connected developers who'd been using casino money laundering operations in Vegas. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit was now treating this as a full RICO case with organized racketeering implications. Banking records can be subpoenaed in fraud investigations. Always keep detailed financial records with timestamps and witnesses to protect yourself from false accusations. While I was building the legal case that would destroy Delia's operation, environmental testing confirmed what my father had always known. The protected wetland extended under the farm property, supporting an ecosystem that included endangered salamander species in our irrigation ponds. Federal habitat protection laws meant that any disruption would trigger not just fines, but criminal environmental charges. I remember kneeling by one of those ponds on a misty morning, holding a tiny salamander in my palm that was smaller than my thumb but carried more legal protection than most corporate executives. The irony was perfect, this little creature that Dad had been protecting without even knowing it was going to help save our entire community. The timing was crucial and required coordination that would make a military operation proud. Town council meetings scheduled for October 15th during peak harvest season. FBI arrests coordinating for October 14th at 6 a.m. Rachel's expose publishing at noon. My environmental complaint filing at close of business October 13th. The final community organizing meeting was held in the school gymnasium, packed with neighbors who'd suffered months of Delia's harassment. Red, white, and blue Save Our Farm signs filled the room while people shared stories of HOA violations, threatening letters, and financial pressure that had nearly broken some families. Carmen stood up and announced our strategy with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and we're about to go on the offensive like Sherman marching to the sea. The applause echoing off those gymnasium walls sounded like freedom. Delia wanted to play hardball with forged documents and federal crimes. Game on. But she'd just picked a fight with people who understood that sometimes protecting home means going to war. Delia's response to discovering my investigation was like watching a cornered animal with a law degree and zero moral boundaries. She'd gotten wind of my FBI coordination through one of her bought county commissioners, and her retaliation was swift, vicious, and incredibly stupid. At 5 a.m. on a Tuesday that started with the acrid smell of diesel exhaust and the sound of hydraulic machinery, I woke up to find a construction crew accidentally destroying my farm's irrigation system. They claimed emergency utility work for contamination concerns, but their excavator was systematically severing every water line that fed my apple trees. The foreman, a sweaty guy with Phoenix plates on his truck and the moral flexibility of a used car salesman, handed me a work order that had my signature on it. Except I'd never signed authorization to destroy my own water supply, and the document was dated for next week. Apparently Delia's forgery department needed better quality control. I called the sheriff while filming everything on my phone, But the real beauty was that my security cameras captured the entire sabotage operation in high definition. These weren't utility workers. They were demolition specialists trying to kill my trees before harvest season. But here's where having emergency permit powers comes in handy. Within 6 hours, I'd issued emergency restoration orders that required immediate water service restoration, bypassed standard inspection delays, and authorized overtime work at county expense. Emergency utility repairs don't require standard permit delays. Life safety and agricultural protection can trigger immediate approval authority. Big Mike's crew worked for free to repair the damage, running new water lines with the efficiency of people who were genuinely pissed off. The sound of their equipment fixing what Delia's people had destroyed was like a mechanical middle finger pointed directly at her house. But Delia wasn't done playing amateur hour criminal mastermind. The bribery escalation was breathtaking in its scope and stupidity. She approached county commissioners with $50,000 cash offers in manila envelopes like she was running a 1950s political machine instead of trying to steal environmental land in 2024. Carmen's wire recordings captured every detail, including Delia's promise that Jake's job will be available soon for someone more cooperative. She tried to blackmail our sheriff with photographs of his weekend poker games, claiming they violated gambling laws. Unfortunately for her, she'd hired a private investigator who was dumber than a box of rocks and photographed the sheriff's church charity poker night where they raised money for veterans. The community intimidation campaign ramped up like something out of a mob movie written by someone who'd never actually met the mob. Anonymous, threatening letters started appearing in mailboxes, but apparently Delia's criminal organization bought their stationery from the same Office Depot and used the same laser printer for all of them. The Kowalski's mailbox got destroyed with a baseball bat by unknown vandals who drove a rental car with Phoenix plates. Because nothing says professional intimidation like leaving a paper trail that leads directly back to your home city. HOA security patrols, really just hired thugs from Phoenix driving slowly past homes at night, started making elderly neighbors afraid to check their mail. But these geniuses didn't realize that small communities talk to each other, and by the third night we had license plate numbers, photos, and enough evidence to make harassment charges stick. My documentation strategy became obsessive. Every threatening letter went into evidence bags for handwriting analysis. Every license plate got traced through DMV records that showed connections to Phoenix rental companies and Delia's shell corporations. The sheriff increased actual patrols while I maintained surveillance from my farm, creating a security net that caught every move these amateur criminals made. The pressure campaign against me personally was like watching someone try to destroy a reputation with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop filled with legal evidence. The local newspaper ran a hit piece claiming I was mentally unstable and obsessed with conspiracy theories, but they made the mistake of quoting directly from Delia's talking points, literally word for word from documents Carmen had copied from her permit applications. When the newspaper tries to destroy your credibility using the same talking points as the person you're investigating, it's like watching someone shoot themselves in the foot with a smoking gun. Delia filed an injunction to prevent me from processing any permits in my own township, claiming conflict of interest made all my decisions invalid. She tried to fast-track resort permits through state-level override, apparently not understanding that environmental regulations don't care about your legal maneuvering timeline. State permit override requires environmental clearance. You can't skip federal law, no matter how many local officials you've bought. The mini-twist came when I used my official access to monitor all permit activity countywide and discovered Delia filing permits under multiple fake company names. Desert Sun Holdings, Phoenix Development Partners, Southwestern Investment Group. She was literally filing permits against herself to create the appearance of multiple interested developers. It was like watching someone play chess against themselves and still somehow losing. That night, standing in my apple orchard with the taste of determination sharp on my tongue, I realized Delia had made the classic mistake of escalating a local dispute into a federal crime spree while leaving evidence everywhere like a criminal scavenger hunt. She wanted to play hardball? Fine. But she just brought a forgery to a federal investigation. With 72 hours until Delia's groundbreaking ceremony, she went into full panic mode and decided to accelerate her timeline like someone who'd never heard of the phrase haste makes waste, or in her case, haste makes federal evidence. At 3 a.m. on October 12th, the rumble of diesel generators and the harsh glare of construction floodlights turned my peaceful rural neighborhood into something that looked like an alien invasion directed by someone with absolutely no respect for noise ordinances. Delia had brought in an out-of-state crew working around the clock to clear land without permits, claiming emergency environmental remediation exemption from county oversight. The smell of fresh-cut wood mixed with diesel exhaust and the acrid scent of chainsaw oil as they started demolishing trees that had been growing since before Delia was born. The sound of ancient oaks falling in the middle of the night was like listening to history being murdered with power tools. But here's where being a permits director for 7 years pays off. I know every exemption in the book, and emergency environmental remediation requires actual environmental emergencies, not manufactured development schedules. I was out of bed and on the phone with the EPA at 3:15 a.m., issuing immediate stop work orders that carried federal enforcement authority. By 6 a.m., sheriff's deputies were serving cease and desist orders while EPA enforcement agents established a federal hold on the entire property. Federal stop work orders supersede all local permits and exemptions. Environmental protection laws create immediate legal barriers that no amount of political pressure can override. The media war that erupted was like watching someone try to fight a forest fire with gasoline-soaked rags. Delia's Phoenix PR firm launched a social media campaign painting me as a corrupt obstructionist who was blocking economic development and job creation. They claimed the resort would bring 200 jobs and $15 million in annual tax revenue. The fake grassroots campaign was beautiful in its transparency. Hundreds of social media accounts with generic names posting identical messages about supporting economic progress. Unfortunately for them, Carmen had been tracking IP addresses and discovered that 90% of the local support was coming from computers in Phoenix and Las Vegas. Rachel countered with her investigation showing Delia's fraud pattern across multiple states, complete with photos of demolished farms and displaced families. The hashtag Willowbrook fraud started trending nationally among people who dealt with similar HOA nightmares and land-grabbing schemes. But the physical intimidation escalated to levels that would make professional criminals embarrassed about the amateur hour operation. My truck tires got slashed in the county parking garage by someone who left fingerprints on the valve stems and dropped a Phoenix hotel receipt at the scene. The threatening voicemail was even more pathetic. "Drop this investigation or your family pays the price," delivered in an accent that screamed, "Guy from Arizona trying to sound tough." They might as well have introduced themselves and left contact information. Security cameras at my farm caught masked figures testing perimeter defenses. But these geniuses drove vehicles registered to Delia's shell companies and parked under streetlights that illuminated their license plates like a criminal photography workshop. Big Mike started providing armed protection, carrying a shotgun that had seen action in 3 deer seasons and looked like it could stop a charging rhinoceros. The man took personal offense at people threatening his community and had the moral clarity that comes from 40 years of honest construction work. The political pressure reached levels that would make a Washington lobbyist proud. County commissioners received anonymous complaints about my abuse of power, but the complaints were typed on letterhead from Delia's Phoenix law firm, with the letterhead badly photocopied out. State officials demanded investigation of my conflict of interest, apparently not understanding that investigating crimes committed against your own property isn't conflict of interest. It's called being a victim with access to evidence. Tony worked overtime filing appeals and injunctions that protected my position, while federal investigators built their case. The sound of his printer running until dawn became a familiar counterpoint to the diesel generators that Delia's crew kept running, despite the stop work orders. The mini-twist came when I discovered that Delia's construction crew included convicted felons from Phoenix using equipment reported stolen from Arizona construction sites. Environmental testing revealed they'd been illegally dumping contaminated soil from previous projects, turning her resort site into a toxic waste dump. Construction with stolen equipment and contaminated materials violates federal racketeering laws. Always verify contractor credentials and equipment ownership before allowing work on your property. Federal investigation intensified like watching a slow-motion avalanche of justice. FBI financial crimes established surveillance posts around the resort site. EPA enforcement opened criminal investigations for wetland destruction. IRS agents raided Delia's Phoenix offices and froze additional accounts across 3 states. I became a protected federal witness with Marshal Service security, which meant professional protection instead of relying on Big Mike's deer hunting skills, though honestly his intimidation factor was probably higher than most federal agents. Standing in my orchard that final night before the ceremony, breathing air that still carried the scent of apple blossoms despite the construction chaos, I realized Delia had transformed a property dispute into a federal crime spree with enough evidence to fill a small library. Tomorrow would be her moment of triumph, or her complete destruction. Either way, I'd be there with cameras rolling. October 14th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning that makes you believe in justice and the possibility that sometimes the good guys actually win. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the resort construction site, with state politicians, local media, and invited investors all gathered to watch Delia's moment of triumph. The irony was delicious. She'd chosen the exact spot where my father used to sit and plan his apple orchards, now converted into a stage for her own destruction. Rachel's exposé had dropped at 9:30 a.m. across multiple news outlets with headlines that must have made Delia's morning coffee taste like liquid regret. HOA president's multi-state, fraud ring exposed, and Phoenix crime family's rural land grab scheme uncovered. Social media exploded with hashtag Willowbrook fraud trending nationally as people shared their own HOA horror stories. By the time the ceremony started, the crowd included more FBI agents in plain clothes than actual supporters, though Delia didn't seem to notice the subtle shift in energy. She stood at the podium in a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, holding a golden shovel like she was about to dig her own grave, which, metaphorically speaking, she was. "Today we break ground on Willowbrook's bright future," she announced in that shrill voice that could strip paint from a barn door. "We've overcome corrupt local officials and environmental extremists to bring jobs, prosperity, and modern development to this community." The crowd murmured politely while federal agents positioned themselves throughout the audience like pieces on a chessboard. I stood near the back, wearing the wire that would capture her final incriminating statements, feeling surprisingly calm for someone about to watch a woman destroy herself with her own words. During the Q&A session, I stepped forward with a manila folder thick enough to use as a weapon. "I have a question about your permits, Miss Prescott." The color drained from her face like someone had pulled a plug, but she maintained that artificial smile that politicians practice in mirrors. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Though I'm surprised you're here, given your obvious bias." "These permit applications contain 47 false statements," I said, projecting my voice so the news cameras could catch every word, "including claims to own 2 acres of federally protected wetland." I pulled out the overlay map showing actual property boundaries versus her fraudulent claims, displaying them on the portable screen that Rachel had helpfully provided. The crowd's murmur shifted to genuine interest as they saw the undeniable evidence of fraud. "You've filed permits under 6 different company names, all leading back to your Phoenix operation. You've forged county documents, bribed local officials, and violated federal environmental protection laws." Delia's mask finally slipped completely. "This is harassment by a corrupt county employee who's fabricating evidence to protect his failed farm." But I was just getting warmed up. "You don't own this land, Ms. Prescott. According to actual county records, your property ends 50 feet from where we're standing. Everything else belongs to the people of this county as protected environmental preserve. Always verify property boundaries through official county records, not owner-provided documents. Fraudulent boundary claims can trigger federal environmental violations." The mini-twist moment came when Delia produced the bribed inspector's report claiming environmental clearance, waving it like a shield against reality. "We have all required federal approvals." That's when FBI agent Morrison stepped forward, badge gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Delia Prescott, you're under arrest for mail fraud, wire fraud, environmental crimes, money laundering, and racketeering conspiracy." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was audible even over the camera shutters and crowd noise. Multiple arrests followed as her Phoenix associates were taken into custody, their expensive suits looking increasingly rumpled as reality set in. But Delia wasn't done performing. As they led her away, she screamed about government conspiracy and corrupt officials protecting their friends, apparently not understanding that accusing the FBI of corruption while being arrested for corruption isn't a winning legal strategy. The crowd erupted in applause led by the Kowalskis, whose weathered faces were streaked with tears of relief. Big Mike started a chant that echoed across the construction site. "Save our farms, save our community." State politicians who'd come for photo opportunities quietly slipped away like vampires fleeing sunlight, while reporters surrounded me for statements about months of investigation and community resistance. "Sometimes doing your job means protecting your neighbors," I told the cameras, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of watching someone's criminal empire collapse in real time. And sometimes protection means standing up to people who think money and corruption can destroy what families spent generations building. EPA officials issued a permanent protection order for the wetland and surrounding buffer zone, while all of Delia's permits were declared void due to fraudulent applications. Construction equipment was impounded as evidence in the federal case. I walked to the edge of the wetland where my father used to fish, finding a small apple sapling growing wild among the protected plants. The scent of clean pond water mixed with apple blossoms in the October breeze, nature already beginning to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The silence after months of construction noise sounded like freedom. 1 month later, federal justice moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine designed to crush organized crime. Delia pleaded guilty to avoid a 25-year sentence, accepting 12 years in federal prison plus $3.2 million in restitution to the investors she'd defrauded. The Phoenix crime ring was dismantled like a house of cards in a hurricane, with 17 total arrests across 4 states. My testimony helped convict 3 county officials for accepting bribes, cleaning house in a way that made local government actually trustworthy again. Sometimes justice tastes like apple pie and feels like vindication, especially when it comes with federal protection for your family's legacy. The HOA was dissolved by court order faster than you can say property rights, lifting restrictive covenants that had been choking the life out of our rural community. The Kowalskis immediately expanded their chicken coop with the enthusiasm of people who'd been freed from bureaucratic prison. Property values stabilized after development pressure disappeared like morning fog in sunlight. The sound of laughter replaced months of tension at our neighborhood potlucks, where conversations shifted from legal strategies to normal topics like weather, crops, and whose tomatoes were winning the unofficial competition that rural communities take surprisingly seriously. Environmental victory came with federal designation of a 200-acre wetland preserve that included my farm, ensuring permanent protection against future development pressure. A federal grant provided $400,000 for habitat restoration and an education center that would teach kids about sustainable agriculture and environmental protection. Environmental designations create permanent legal protection for sensitive lands. Federal habitat protection trumps local development pressure every single time. My professional recognition included being named Permits Director of the Year by the state association, though honestly the real reward was watching our community heal. I was invited to testify before the state legislature about municipal corruption, helping develop new protocols for identifying fraudulent permit applications before they can damage communities. The Morrison apple farm expanded to 60 acres, using properties seized from Delia's criminal enterprise, creating an agricultural operation that my father would have been proud to see. We partnered with the Agricultural College for organic farming research and became a destination for school field trips where kids could learn that apples don't actually grow in grocery store plastic bags. The community social good initiative started with the Morrison Family Scholarship for agricultural students, funded by my federal whistleblower reward and the book rights that Rachel helped me negotiate. The first recipient was Carmen's daughter, who's studying environmental law with the goal of protecting rural communities from future land grabbers. I started dating Rachel after her investigation won a Pulitzer nomination, though our first official date was testifying together at a congressional hearing about rural land protection. Romance blooms in strange places when you're both committed to justice and really good investigative work. The annual Willowbrook Apple Festival launched the following October, celebrating community resilience, environmental protection, and the victory of regular people over organized crime. Local vendors, live music, and tours of the wetland preserve created an event that drew visitors from 3 states. The sound of children's laughter mixing with bluegrass music and the rhythmic squeaking of our old apple press became the new soundtrack of our community, so much better than diesel generators and legal threats. But vigilance remains essential. I established a hotline for residents facing development pressure and train other rural permits officials to recognize corruption patterns. My case became a model for federal environmental enforcement, proving that sometimes one person with access to evidence can protect entire communities. Corruption prevention requires ongoing community awareness and official accountability. Document everything, verify all claims, and never assume criminals are smarter than honest people with determination. The phone call came last month from a permits director in the neighboring county. Similar patterns were emerging. Aggressive development pressure targeting organic dairy farms, suspicious city council votes, and a developer with casino connections. "Jake," she said, "I think we need your help again." I looked out at my apple orchard where morning mist was rising from the protected wetland and my father's trees were preparing for another harvest season. Sometimes protecting home means fighting battles you never expected, but the alternative is watching everything you love get bulldozed by people who mistake greed for progress. "I'll be right there," I said. Because some fights are worth having and some places are worth protecting, no matter how many HOA Karens think they can buy what isn't for sale. Drop a comment about your worst HOA or developer experience. Your story might help someone else facing similar pressure. Hit subscribe and the bell icon for more. David versus Goliath stories where knowledge, community, and federal law triumph over corruption and greed.